Now, let's go back. We go back to August of 1970. Um, the and let's review a little bit what the conditions were. The big chains, the nationwide chains, the A&Ps, the Safeways, the Krogers, and so forth, were dominant. The regional chains had not quite asserted their economic power and success and management skill at that point. Nevertheless, the profitability in the big chains was quite modest, 1 to 1.5%. Gross margin, 20%. Front end, as I said earlier, 25% of gross margin. And shrink, unidentified loss, was in the order of about 2% to 3%, depending upon the retail organization. If you recall, back in those days, a chain, or even a large number, even an independent with multiple stores, used what they call planograms. Planogram is, in effect, a decision of how many facings or how many products on which shelf for each product. And they were imposed across vast regions so that a store in Boston might have the same number of items, facings, location, etc., as a store in South Brooklyn. There was no demographic stocking of stores at the time. You might call that pretty dull, but that's the way they were able to control without in-store automation. There were no big box stores. There were no really important small specialty stores. There were no credit cards. And stores, food stores, provided check cashing facilities for more checks than all of the banking industry put together. Those were the environments. The manufacturers more or less dominated certain categories. Procter & Gamble dominated the detergent aisle and, in effect, helped the stores decide how to array detergents not only for Procter & Gamble, but for all of the competitors. PepsiCo and Coke dominated the beverage aisle. Kraft dominated the refrigerated boxes. And so there was an important dominance by the grocery manufacturers, even when it came down to deals. A deal would be proposed by a manufacturer, 10 cents off if you buy a carload, if you put it on the end of an aisle. Now we're going to come back to this at the end, and I'm going to tell you that this automation fundamentally changed the relationship, the marketing power of the manufacturers vis-a-vis the retailers. It fundamentally shifted it from the manufacturers to the retailers. So we'll come back to that. In terms of information, the information that was vitally important to determine marketing strategies and objectives was essentially available from Nielsen, who basically did samples. They counted boxes in some 7,000 stores. Not real efficient, but it was widely used by marketing executives to figure out what to do next, how to price, etc. And then there was an organization called SAMMY, Selling Areas Marketing Inc. SAMMY was actually a name given to it by its president and founder, Matty Matamore, whose dog was named Sam. Anyway, what SAMMY did is they did a deal with most of the retail distributors and chains in the entire United States to receive a computer tape of all of the specific items that were delivered out of a warehouse into an area like the Boston metro area, the Philly metro area. And after a few years, they were measuring by full enumeration fully 80% of all of the grocery items sold in the United States. It was not retail sales, but it rather was warehouse withdrawal. So it didn't knock out Nielsen that was effectively measuring retail sales, but these were two, I would have to say, complementary and powerful tools that were later basically fundamentally changed by the results of data capture at the point of sale. At this time, keep in mind also that there were very limited number of types of departments. There were no card departments. There were no flour departments. There was maybe a meat department and maybe a deli department, but there wasn't any of the specialized departments that you now see in a store. In fact, I often thought, wouldn't it be fun to take the CEO of a couple of big retail chains from the 1970s and have them visit a big store today? it would be hardly recognizable to them in terms of the change, and a lot of the change was facilitated by this automation program. Now, thanks to Sammy and specifically Clark Matamore, one of the things that we very early did in the study in the fall of 1970 was we got some information with regard to just how many items there were sold through grocery stores in the United States, and the answer is about 1 million. One interesting point you might find amusing, the highest volume item sold in grocery stores was tomato soup. Campbell's tomato soup was the most prolific item sold throughout the entire United States. Anyway, it was crucial to know how many items, because how many items was going to determine, in some respects, the length of the code necessary to facilitate automation. And for the remaining several years, Sammy was a very, very valuable assistant behind the scenes in helping us determine variations and alternatives that we might consider. Now, one last point. Checkers, checkout clerks, were quite proficient. They were real quick. Many of them remembered prices. Many of them never even looked at the prices on the packages, but they weren't so accurate. And most people at the time assumed that the errors were against the consumer. I'm going to come back to that point. You're going to learn perhaps a surprising fact that we determined through some fascinating tests.